My son shoved me to the ground in front of 40 relatives at his own daughter's birthday party. Nobody moved to help me up. What he did not know was that I had been sitting on a secret for 6 years. A secret that owned the very ground his fancy house was sitting on. The backyard smelled like charcoal smoke and cut grass. Pink and gold balloons sagged in the July heat, spelling out Happy 7th Birthday Lily across the porch railing. I stood near the drink table holding a paper cup of lemonade, watching my granddaughter chase bubbles across the lawn, and for a moment everything felt normal. Then Marcus called my name. He had that look, the one I had learned to dread over the last few years. Tight jaw, flushed cheeks, a man who had already had 2 beers and was looking for somewhere to put his anger. He walked straight up to me in front of everyone and asked if I had thought about what he'd asked me last week. I told him I had. I told him no. The yard went quiet the way a room goes quiet right before a storm. He asked me again, louder this time, in front of his in-laws, his neighbors, his daughter's entire second-grade class. He needed me to co-sign a loan for a new commercial property. $500,000. He said it like it was a small favor between family. I told him I would not put my name on something I had not seen the paperwork for. That was when he grabbed the front of my shirt. He did not punch me. He shoved me, hard, with both hands, the way you shove someone you've stopped being afraid of losing. My heel caught the edge of the patio stone, and I went down onto the grass in front of 40 people who had just been singing Happy Birthday 20 minutes earlier. I heard a few gasps. I heard someone's phone camera click. I did not hear anyone come to help me up. Not my daughter-in-law Diane, who stood frozen by the cake table with her hand over her mouth. Not my brother Frank, who suddenly found his shoes very interesting. Not a single one of Marcus's golfing buddies, the men he liked to call his real family. I pushed myself up off the lawn slowly, brushing grass off my slacks, and Marcus stood over me, breathing hard, like he had just won something. He told the yard that I was a stubborn old man who didn't understand business, who didn't understand sacrifice, who had spent his whole life as a glorified electrician, and didn't know what real success looked like. I did not argue with him. I straightened my shirt. I picked my cup back up off the ground, even though it was empty now, just to have something to hold. And I looked past him, toward the wrought iron gate at the side of the yard, where a small brass plaque was bolted to the post. Property managed by Cresthaven Holdings. I had heard that name before. 6 years before, in a conference room with 2 old friends and a lawyer, signing papers I had never told a single member of my family about. I smiled at my son. It was not a kind smile, and for the first time in years, I watched something flicker across his face that almost looked like uncertainty. Marcus was 8 years old when his mother died. Pancreatic cancer. 11 months from diagnosis to funeral. I remember the exact weight of him in my arms the night before her service, asking me in a small voice if I was going to leave too. I told him no. I meant it with everything I had. I worked 22 years as a journeyman electrician, the kind of job where your knees give out before your paycheck ever catches up to your dreams. I raised him alone in a 3-bedroom rambler with a leaky roof I fixed myself 3 different times. I coached his little league team, even though I didn't know a curveball from a fastball. I sat through every parent-teacher conference by myself, in a folding chair meant for 2. He grew up sharp, sharper than me, certainly sharper than his teachers expected. He got into business school on a partial scholarship, and I covered the rest by taking on every overtime electrical job within 40 miles. By the time he graduated, I had aged 10 years, and he had a job offer from a commercial real estate firm downtown. I was so proud of him I could barely speak at his graduation. Somewhere along the way, pride curdled into something else in him. Maybe it was the suits. Maybe it was the men he started having lunch with. Men who measured a person's worth by the size of their portfolio. He married Diane, a sweet, anxious woman from a modest family who seemed to love him more than he loved himself. They bought a house bigger than anything I had ever set foot in growing up, and slowly, the son who used to call me every Sunday started calling only when he needed something. 6 years ago, 2 old friends from my electrical union, Walt and Eugene, came to me with an idea. We had each put away modest pensions over the decades, nothing extravagant, but steady. Walt's nephew worked in commercial property management and had identified a small holding company looking for quiet investors, men willing to put money into mid-sized retail and office properties and let professionals run the day-to-day. We pooled what we had. It was not a fortune by Marcus's standards, but it was real, and it was ours, and over 6 years it had grown into something substantial. We never told our families. Walt used to joke that the moment your kids find out you have money, you stop being their father and start being their bank. I laughed at the time. I did not know how true it would turn out to be. I never imagined the company we'd quietly invested in would end up holding the lease and management contract for the very strip of commercial property where my son's office sat, and where, I would soon learn, he was about to make the worst financial decision of his life. Back at the party, Diane found me near the gate while Marcus accepted handshakes from his golf buddies like he'd just closed a deal instead of knocking his father into the dirt. She did not apologize for him. She just looked at me, eyes wet, and asked quietly if I was all right. I told her I was fine. She hesitated, glancing back toward the house, and said something strange before walking away. "He's been weird about paperwork lately," she said, locking his office door. "I don't know what's going on with him anymore." I tucked that sentence away like a man tucks away a spare key. I drove home with the windows down, letting the warm evening air pull the last of the grass and humiliation off my skin. My house was quiet the way it always was now, ever since my wife passed and Marcus moved 20 minutes across town into a life I no longer recognized. I poured myself a glass of water, sat down at the kitchen table, and called Eugene. He answered on the third ring, the sound of a baseball game playing faintly behind him. I asked him a simple question. Did Cresthaven Holdings currently manage any commercial property on Birchwood Avenue? There was a pause, the click of a remote muting the television. He told me yes. A row of office suites near the interstate. He asked why I wanted to know. I told him my son's company leased space there. Eugene let out a low whistle and told me something I did not expect. Just last month, the management office had received an unusual request. Someone matching my son's company name had applied to lease an additional unit, nearly tripling their footprint, and had listed a personal guarantor on the application, a guarantor whose name and social security information matched mine. I sat very still at my kitchen table, the phone pressed hard against my ear. I had never signed anything for Marcus's business. I had never even seen this lease application. Eugene told me the paperwork was sitting with their legal compliance department for standard verification, since I happened to also be listed, quietly, as a controlling member of the holding company itself. Nobody on the leasing side had connected the two names yet. As far as they knew, I was simply a coincidence flagged for review. I thanked him and hung up the phone slowly, my hand strangely steady considering what I had just heard. My son had shoved me into the dirt in front of 40 people for refusing to put my name on a loan. And somehow, my name was already on paperwork I had never touched, for a deal 3 times the size of the one he'd asked me about out loud. I thought about Diane's words at the gate. He's been weird about paperwork lately, locking his office door. I thought about the brass plaque on the fence post, the one bearing the name of a company I had quietly helped build from nothing. I did not feel anger in that moment, not the hot, useless kind that had filled the backyard an hour earlier. What I felt was colder than that, and far more useful. I picked the phone back up and dialed my attorney's after-hours line. I told her I needed to see every document with my name on it, anywhere, as soon as possible. She asked me if everything was all right. I told her I honestly did not know yet. But I intended to find out exactly how far my son had been willing to go, and exactly whose signature he had used to get there. Outside my kitchen window, the sun was finally going down over the same quiet street where I had raised him alone, one overtime shift at a time. I had given that boy everything I had for 30 years. It was time to find out what he had been quietly taking. My attorney's name was Renata Cole. She had handled the paperwork for the holding company 6 years earlier, and she was not a woman who liked surprises. She met me at her office 2 mornings later, a stack of files already waiting on her desk. She told me she had pulled everything filed under my name across every database her firm had access to, county records, bank filings, anything tied to my social security number that crossed into the public or semi-public record. What she found took the floor out from under me slower than a shove ever could. 8 months earlier, Marcus had refinanced the mortgage on his house. Nothing unusual there, on paper, except the original down payment on that house, the one that had let him qualify for a loan that size in the first place, had come from a private loan I gave him 11 years ago, back when he was a junior associate, trying to impress a real estate firm that wanted him to look the part. We had signed an informal agreement at the time. Nothing fancy, just a single page stating the funds were a loan against future repayment, secured loosely by a small percentage interest in the property itself, recorded quietly at the county clerk's office as a protective measure my old union buddy Walt had insisted I take. I had never enforced it. I had never even brought it up again. As far as I knew, Marcus had forgotten it existed. He had not forgotten, he had simply decided to make it disappear. Renata slid a second document across the desk, a refinancing release form, the kind a lender requires when an existing lien holder agrees to step aside so a new mortgage can take priority. It carried my signature, releasing my claim on the property entirely. I had never signed it. I stared at the looping R in my own name, a letter I had written exactly the same way for 60 years, and felt something settle in my chest that was heavier than the fall onto the patio stones had been. Renata asked me gently if I wanted to involve the county recorder's fraud unit immediately. I told her not yet. She looked at me the way she always did when she suspected I was about to do something she would have to clean up later. She asked me why. I told her I wanted to understand the whole shape of it first. A man who fakes one signature rarely stops there, and I wanted to know exactly how deep this went before I pulled on the thread and brought the entire thing down around him. It took 11 days of quiet, careful work. Renata brought in a forensic document examiner, a soft-spoken woman named Priya who had spent 20 years testifying in court about ink pressure and pen strokes, and the small tells that separate a real signature from a forged one. She did not need long with my release form. She told us the signature had been traced. Likely lifted directly from an old document, probably the original loan agreement itself, scanned and reproduced with a steady hand and a light table. Whoever did it was patient, careful, someone who had access to my old paperwork, which meant someone inside the family, or someone Marcus trusted enough to hand it to. I asked her if she could tell who actually held the pen. She could not. Forgery rarely leaves a name behind. But she could tell us, with complete certainty, that the hand was not mine. That same week, the lease application Eugene had mentioned came across Renata's desk through a different channel entirely, pulled as part of the holding company's standard compliance review. The personal guarantor section listed my name, my social security number, and a signature that matched the same careful forgery on the mortgage release. 2 documents, same forged hand, $500,000 on one, and now a commercial lease, nearly $1 million on the other, both built on a foundation of my name without my knowledge or consent. I sat in Renata's office, holding both pages side by side under the lamp, and for the first time since the backyard, I let myself feel exactly how angry I was. I did not show it. I had spent 30 years learning how to carry weight without letting my hands shake, and that training held. What troubled me more than the forgery itself was the math. Marcus did not need my signature to refinance his own house. A man with his income and credit could have managed that on his own, even with a lien on the books, simply by paying it off. He had chosen forgery over a phone call. He had chosen deception over simply asking his father for help, the same father he had grabbed by the shirt 3 weeks earlier rather than ask politely. That told me something about the size of the hole he was actually standing in. A man does not forge his father's signature over a manageable problem. He forges it when he is drowning, and asking out loud would mean admitting exactly how far underwater he has gone. I thought about Diane's words again. Locking his office door. Weird about paperwork. I asked Renata if there was a way to find out, quietly, how Marcus's actual business was performing. Not the version he presented at golf outings and backyard parties, but the real numbers. She told me there was. It would simply take a little more patience. I told her patience was the one thing I had never been short on. Diane called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice low, almost a whisper, like she was speaking from inside a closet. She told me she needed to talk, and could I meet her somewhere away from the house. We sat in a corner booth at a diner 2 towns over, the kind of place where nobody we knew would walk in. She wrapped both hands around a coffee cup she never drank from, and told me she had overheard something 3 nights earlier that she could not stop thinking about. Marcus had been on a call in his locked office, voice low but sharp, the kind of tone he used when he thought no one could hear him losing control. She had been passing the hallway with a basket of laundry and stopped without meaning to. He had been talking to someone about, in her words, fixing the Birchwood paperwork properly this time. He said if his father refused again, in person, formally, there was another way to handle it, one that would not require asking permission at all. He mentioned the family land near the lake, the half-acre plot that had belonged to my late wife's parents, and that the whole family technically still held jointly, mostly forgotten, mostly untouched for 20 years. Diane told me he had said something that made her blood run cold. He said paperwork doesn't argue back, not the way people do. I asked her if she knew who he had been talking to. She did not know a name. But she said the conversation ended with Marcus saying he would have everything ready by the end of the month and thanking the person for, quote, knowing how to make old documents look new again. I sat with that sentence for a long moment, watching the steam rise off my untouched coffee. Diane reached across the table and took my hand. The first kind gesture toward me from inside that family in longer than I cared to admit. She told me she was scared of what he had become, scared for Lily, growing up watching her father solve every problem by stepping over people, and scared, quietly, of what might happen to their own marriage if any of this ever came fully into the light. I told her she had done the right thing telling me. She asked me, very softly, what I was planning to do. I told her the truth. I did not know yet, not the final shape of it, but I knew exactly what I would not do. I would not shove him into the dirt the way he had shoved me. I would not raise my voice or my hands or make a single threat I could not back with paper. I would simply make sure that when the truth finally stood up in the room, it had every single document it needed standing right behind it. Diane nodded slowly, wiped her eyes once, and told me she would help in any way she could. I thanked her, paid for the coffee neither of us had finished, and drove home through the dark with the radio off, already making a list in my head of exactly which doors I needed Renata to open next. For the next 3 weeks, I did not speak to Marcus at all. He called twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. He left no messages either time, which told me almost as much as a message would have. A man who is innocent calls back immediately, confused and hurt. A man who is guilty waits, watching to see how much you already know. I spent those weeks at Renata's office instead, going through documents until my eyes ached. We traced the lake property records first, the half-acre plot from my late wife's parents. It was still held jointly, exactly as Diane had said, technically requiring all 4 surviving family signatures to transfer or encumber in any way. Renata filed a quiet protective notice with the county, flagging the parcel for any unusual activity, the legal equivalent of a silent tripwire. Then we turned to the actual business. Priya's forensic work on the forged signatures was airtight enough to stand up anywhere, but Renata wanted more than proof of forgery. She wanted the full picture of why a man would risk this much. A private financial investigator she trusted spent 10 days quietly pulling together what he could from public filings, vendor complaints, and court dockets. The truth, when it finally landed on Renata's desk in a single manila folder, was worse than I expected. Marcus's commercial real estate firm was not simply struggling. It was 11 weeks from insolvency. He had personally guaranteed 2 failed developments using inflated property valuations that 2 different banks were already quietly investigating. The Birchwood lease he had tried to guarantee under my forged signature was not an expansion. It was a last desperate attempt to convince one more bank that his company still had momentum, using my name and my standing in the very holding company I controlled to make himself look credible again. He was not a man chasing growth. He was a drowning man, grabbing for anything that floated, and what floated easiest was his father's good name. I did not feel triumphant reading it. I felt tired, the particular tiredness of a parent watching a child's choices finally catch up to him in a way no amount of love could soften. I called a meeting with Renata, Eugene, and Walt that same afternoon. I told them I had decided exactly how I wanted to handle the next step, and it would not involve a single raised voice. I wanted everything done through proper channels. The bank's fraud department, the county recorder, the holding company's own compliance office. I wanted the truth to surface the way water surfaces, through pressure and time, not through a confrontation in someone's living room. Eugene asked me if I was sure I did not want to simply call Marcus and lay it all out myself first. I told him no. A man cornered in private can still talk his way out of consequences. A man whose lies are confirmed independently, by people with no reason to lie for him, has nowhere left to stand. We set the trap not with anger, but with paperwork. Renata filed the fraud report with the bank's internal compliance division first, the one that had issued the mortgage refinance. Banks move carefully, but they move fast once forged signatures enter the conversation, since it exposes them to liability if they ignore it. Within 4 days, the bank had frozen further disbursement on Marcus's refinance and opened its own internal investigation, separate entirely from anything I had done, simply because federal banking regulations required it the moment forgery was credibly alleged. At the same time, the holding company's compliance office, the same one that had flagged my name as a coincidence weeks earlier, finally connected the dots once Renata formally identified me as the controlling member whose identity had been used without authorization on the lease guarantee. That triggered an automatic hold on the entire lease application and a mandatory review meeting, standard procedure for any compliance flag involving a controlling stakeholder. I did not ask for the meeting to happen. The system Marcus had tried to exploit simply did what it was built to do once the truth entered it. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning at the holding company's regional office, a plain conference room with fluorescent lighting and a long table that had nothing decorative about it at all. Marcus was required to attend as the applicant on the lease. I was required to attend as the flagged controlling member. Renata would attend as my counsel. The bank sent a compliance officer as well, since the mortgage fraud and the lease fraud had, by Thursday, been formally connected as related matters by both institutions independently. Marcus did not know I would be in that room until he walked through the door and saw me already seated. I watched his face cycle through three things very quickly: confusion, then calculation, the same look he used to wear before a big presentation, trying to find the angle that would let him walk out on top. Then, slowest of all, something that finally looked like fear. He sat down across from me without a word. Diane was not in the room. This was not a family conversation. This was a compliance review, conducted by professionals who had no emotional investment in protecting him, which was exactly the point. I folded my hands on the table and waited for the meeting to begin, the same way I used to wait for a fuse box to finish sparking before I reached inside it. Patience, I had learned over 60 years, was not the absence of anger. It was simply anger that had learned how to wait for the right moment to be useful. The compliance officer from the bank spoke first. She laid out, in flat procedural language, what their investigation had found. The mortgage refinance release bearing my signature had been examined by an independent forensic document expert and determined to be a forgery with a high degree of certainty. She placed Priya's written report on the table, along with the original release form beside a genuine sample of my signature from county records, the difference visible even to an untrained eye once you knew where to look. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. Renata spoke next, calm and precise, never raising her voice, walking the room through the timeline. The original 1,989 loan agreement. The protective lien filed at the time. My complete lack of knowledge or consent regarding the refinance release. The matching forged signature on the Birchwood lease guarantee, confirmed by the same forensic examiner. Marcus tried to speak twice. Both times, the compliance officer asked him to wait until the full record had been presented, the same flat patience the world shows everyone equally once paperwork takes over from emotion. When Renata finished, the holding company's compliance director, a quiet man named Mr. Patterson who had said almost nothing the entire meeting, finally turned to Marcus directly. He asked him plainly whether he had forged his father's signature on either document. Marcus's jaw worked silently for a moment. He looked at me. And for the first time since the backyard, he was not looking at me like an obstacle. He was looking at me like a man, finally seeing the size of the hole he had dug. He admitted it. He said it quietly, almost too quietly for the recorder running on the table to pick up, but it picked it up anyway. He said he had been desperate. He said he thought he could fix everything quietly and put the lien money back before anyone noticed, that he never meant for any of it to become permanent, that he had hired someone online to replicate the signature from old scanned paperwork he still had from years ago. Mr. Patterson informed him, in the same flat tone he had used for the question, that both the bank and the holding company were legally obligated to report confirmed signature fraud involving real estate transactions to the appropriate authorities, and that this process was already underway independent of any personal arrangement between family members. Marcus turned to me, his voice cracking for the first time, and asked if there was anything I could do to stop it. I told him the truth. I told him I had not engineered any of this to destroy him. I had simply refused to let his lies stand on paper, and paper, once it enters a bank's compliance system, does not care whose father is sitting at the table. I told him the only thing left in my control was what happened after the institutions finished their part. The criminal side of it moved slowly, the way these things do. The district attorney's office reviewed the forensic findings, interviewed Marcus, and ultimately offered a deferred prosecution agreement rather than a felony charge, largely because both banks declined to pursue maximum penalties once full restitution was guaranteed, and because I made it clear, in writing, that I supported a path that held him accountable without erasing the rest of his life. He surrendered control of the lease application entirely, which collapsed under its own weight within a week. He sold the commercial property his failing developments depended on, at a steep loss, to satisfy the banks and avoid further legal exposure. He lost the office downtown that had made him feel, for a few years, like a man who had outgrown the father who raised him in a three-bedroom rambler. The house stayed in the family, in Diane and Lily's name primarily, protected by Renata's careful restructuring of what remained of my old lien interest, the one Marcus had tried to erase with a forged signature. Diane and I grew closer in the months that followed, in the quiet way people do when they have stood on the same side of a hard truth. She brought Lily to see me most Sundays, and some weeks, slowly, almost shyly, Marcus came too. He did not come the first few times. When he finally did, he sat across my kitchen table, the same table where I had once spread out paperwork that exposed everything he had tried to hide, and he did not ask me for money or signatures or favors. He asked me, plainly, if I thought he could ever be the kind of father to Lily that I had been to him. I told him that depended entirely on whether he had learned the one lesson that mattered most. That love, real love, does not get to write checks against another person's name without asking. That respect is not something you inherit by blood. It is something you rebuild, slowly, the same patient way you build anything worth keeping, one honest day at a time. He nodded, and for the first time in years, I believed he actually understood it. I still live in the same house on the same quiet street where I raised him alone, decades ago, one overtime shift at a time. Some evenings I sit on the back porch with a cup of coffee and watch the sun go down over a neighborhood that has watched me grow old without ever once making me feel small. I learned something through all of it that I want to leave you with. You do not have to shout to win back your dignity. You do not have to raise a hand to answer one raised against you. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is simply refuse to let a lie stand unchallenged and let the truth take its own steady time to stand up in the room. If this story meant something to you, if you believe patience and the truth can outlast even the people who are supposed to love us best, hit the like button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you want to see what happens when an entire family finally learns whose name was on the deed all along, stay close. There's another story waiting for you right after this one, and I promise you, it is just as deserving of being heard all the way to the end.